Good afternoon and welcome to our organizing and messaging panel. I'm Chelsea McClintock, Vice President of the ACS Student Chapter at Texas A&M University School of Law. I am pleased to introduce the panel moderator, Eric Marshall, who will in turn introduce the esteemed panel this afternoon. Eric is the Executive Director of the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. He joined the organization this year after many years of dedicated leadership in civic engagement, election reform, and voting rights at State Voices and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law. His full bio is in your program, and I highly encourage that you read it. It's very impressive. And with that, I turn the microphone over to Eric.
Thank you very much, Chelsea, and thank everyone for being here. It's always great to speak in front of such a great group of young leaders, and we're so excited to talk to you guys about what some of the issue organizing and good work is happening nationally in the field as we seek to make the change that we all want in the next few years heading into 2016, but really beyond 2016, because where we are and where we need to go in terms of making change in this country it's a long fight. It's going to be long term. It's going to be focused in the states and in the cities. It's focused around community power building, and so I think you're in for a really good conversation about the different tactics and strategies, and particularly how the legal community and as you guys embark on your careers, how you guys can engage in this either as a career or in pro bono or other capacities. So really appreciate you guys being here. So we're going to do, each of the panelists is going to do quick 5-minute introductory statements, and then we're going to go into a little bit of moderated Q&A and keep time for 20 minutes to engage in a conversation with you all to answer the questions you guys all see. I appreciate our panelists have a lot to say, but they're going to be real focused in their comments to keep us on track. So I'm going to start not really in order with where people are sitting, and I'll introduce the panelists as I ask the questions, but kind of through the dais. So I'm going to start with Nick Rathod, who is the Executive Director of the State Innovation Exchange, or SIX. I'll talk a little bit about his new organization, and his bio is in the packet. So Nick, where do you see advancements happening across the country in a policy arena, particularly as it relates to the working class, middle class voters?
Well, thanks, and thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning. I know it's not easy, but so to just real quick on SIX, because it's rather new. We're a new sort of action tank that's focused in the states on advancing progressive policies across the country. And the backdrop for it is that, for the last 40 years, conservatives have invested in this really robust infrastructure in the states, with groups like ALEC, with groups like the State Policy Network, and they've spent resources in training, in policy development, in politics, and have this infrastructure that now they're sort of reaping the rewards from. They control now more state chambers than they have since the 1900s. They have an ability, and that allows them an ability to move policies. Like if you look at Stand Your Ground, it moved from Florida to 17 states in 1 year. We don't have anything even close to that. So what SIX is an attempt to try to start investing in state infrastructure to be able to move policies forward. If you look at what's happening in DC, it's completely broken. They're having snowball fights on the Senate floor, debating whether climate change actually exists or what parts of the government to shut down. It's a joke. And meanwhile, in the rest of the country, there's this real fight, there's this real debate about working and middle class families and whether you're gonna have a country that's run by corporate America or run by people. And we're on the people's side. And so what we're doing is really connecting with legislators, training them up, organizing legislators towards really advancing a people's agenda in the states. And so currently, there's some trends happening to your question, which are promising. There's minimum wage fights that are being won, and I think we'll hear a little bit about that. There's fights going on to eliminate the tipped minimum wage credit. In Oregon, just yesterday, they passed a voter bill. Wow, nice, great work. Where you can automatically register when you get a driver's license. You automatically get registered to vote when you get a driver's license, which is great. And then there's online registration bills going around the country. And then there's a lot of, sorry, my throat is dried. I had too many drinks last night. But there's all these other bills that are really focused on working class and middle class families as well. In Nevada, there's an equal pay measure moving. In Iowa, there's wage theft bills moving. But the one thing that we want to do, and that we just launched this campaign this last week, this opportunity agenda in the states, and you may have read about it over the week in Politico and other places, but it really is focused on nationalizing what these progressive legislators are doing in their states and connecting them to a higher narrative. So, you have these things happening, but you only hear about this right-to-work bill, which is horrible, which just passed in Wisconsin. And but we are organized and really trying to move this progressive agenda around this common narrative. So that's sort of the campaign that we've been focused on, and we'll be providing technical support, communication support, and sort of talking points around those things for state legislators around the country. And then what we're doing right now is also building towards 2016, where we're really going to get into states and drive campaigns and be aggressive about it. To try to knock them on their heels a little bit around the things that we care about. So that's coming up, but right now what we're focused on is really messaging and supporting the legislators that are already doing great work in their states. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Nick, and look forward to kind of continuing that conversation. So we're going to keep it kind of at the 100-foot level, or actually not more than 100 feet. That would be really close. 1,600-foot level in terms of our two panelists that represent more national organizations. And so I'm pleased to introduce Kirk Adams, who is the International Executive Vice President for SEIU, which means he's kind of a big deal. And obviously, labor issues are very much in the news in the forefront, and there's been both, I think, a lot of steps back. Wisconsin is a perfect example of that, but also some progress around living wage, tip wage, the fight for 15, and so we're seeing some really great new kind of organizing tactics that are happening in the states on a new labor movement. So Kirk was interested in just hearing a little bit more about some of those new organizing tactics, some of the new labor movement and living wage fights in the states.
Thanks, Eric. First, I want to just appreciate the fact that the attention to affirmative action in this group, that you allowed someone over 35 to come and talk to you, is really brilliant. So as Eric said, I am an executive officer of SEIU. I've been with SEIU forever, over 30 years. And what I am proud about SEIU, most of all, not that it's the biggest or the fastest growing or whatever union, is that it has always tried to figure out how to push models of organizing to touch workers that wouldn't be touched otherwise under the law. And whether it's justice for janitors or organizing home care workers or contingent workers or now fast food workers and child care workers, or whether it's new models like we tried out with a variety of folks in Seattle in terms of raising the minimum wage to 15. We basically have taken the fundamental position that change in organizing has to keep up with change in the economy. Because fundamentally, organizing or labor law in this country has not kept up with the economy. It's basically stuck in a 19th century model, and here we are in the 21st century. The NLRA really doesn't work for employees, it doesn't work for employers, it doesn't work for really anybody except for maybe some labor lawyers. And I think that's really the problem, is that we are still sort of caught in some models. And I don't know how many of you all have taken your labor law course in law school, but I would advise you just throw those books away. Honestly, it is not working for us. Obviously not for unions. I mean, the news is not good for unions. Our density is going down. Right to work is on the rise. And eventually wages have been stagnant for 10 years. So we need new models. We need new organizations to put workers into. I'll tip my hat to Workers' Defense Fund, for Workers' Defense Project over here, because they actually are looking at those models. But so are we at a variety of ways and a variety of locations. These models are really based somewhat on new interpretations of the law, but almost always about new interpretations and new use of technology, because that's really the work with workers now is less bound by collective bargaining or by other sort of technical issues of law or of agreements, but more about how do you put workers into motion, how do they drive to raise their wages, how do they build organizations that can be sustainable, and how do we replicate those organizations over and over again. And so with the fast food campaign or with the Fight for 15 campaign or other campaigns that we're starting, we actually have just thrown out all the ideas of sort of ever getting a collective bargaining agreement for these workers, but actually building power for these workers so that they indeed will, in fact, be able to impact their wages, impact their workplace, and impact their community. And that's changed our politics. That's changed everything for us. So I think at this point, we are sort of at a really major turning point. At least our union is, and a lot of our partners. And I think we want to sort of figure this out. I'm not saying lawyers don't have a role. They have a critical role here. Our fight with McDonald's and with Burger King and with Wendy's is about a fight based largely in the law around franchise and how franchise and what their status is in this economy. So there's work for you out there. We hope to see you there.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the first two panelists modeling good behavior in terms of staying under the time limits. You guys are. There's a reason why we started that way. So a lot for Lucy and Karla to live up to here. So I'm gonna turn to Karla. And Kirk kind of referenced Workers' Defense Fund in his remarks, so it's a good kind of transition point. So Karla is the Employment and Legal Services Director, the Workers' Defense Project based here in Texas and in Austin, Texas. So. Karla, as someone here on the ground, and particularly in a state that obviously has its challenges for working people, can you talk a little bit about the intersection of legal and issue campaigns for low-wage workers, particularly as it relates to racial justice?
Well, thank you for inviting Workers' Defense to this discussion. I think it's important for you guys to understand the model that Workers' Defense Project operates under in order for you to fully understand how we manage our campaigns and how we address issues of systemic justice for low-wage workers here in Texas. So Workers' Defense Project is a worker center, and a worker center is primarily a geographic or sector-based center that provides a number of services to low-wage workers. Worker centers have been on the rise in the last couple of years, especially as Mr. Adams referenced the decline of unions and the difficulty that unions have to continue organizing and the difficulties that unions do face. Worker centers have sort of sprung up around the country to really supplement that work. And Workers' Defense Project, for example, works a lot with unions. The SEIU is one of our huge supporters, as well as some of the other national unions. And so it's really a nuanced collaboration between entities that are addressing systemic issues for workers. In terms of the work that I do at Workers' Defense Project, so I direct the legal services program in the organization. We utilize every toolkit available to us to address the issues that workers in Texas face. We use legal channels, we use policy, and we use community organizing techniques to really affect change for low-wage workers here. Most of our campaigns our larger campaigns are based around the construction industry, and that is because that is really who was walking through our door, and that is really the need that was voiced to Workers' Defense Project from the workers that were coming in. And so our model is very much based on providing the space for workers themselves to let us know what's going on, what are the issues that need to be addressed, and our workers are very much involved in our campaigns, informing our campaigns at every step of the way. And then in terms of utilizing these techniques, it's as you guys probably are aware, the law has its own limitations, as does policy, as does organizing. But if you use all of these tools collectively and you learn how to really harness them and utilize them in a way where they can supplement each other, the change and the effect that you can really bring about is much more obviously than if you were to use one of them individually. And there are obviously some challenges and some benefits in using this model, especially as attorneys, where you clearly have to have the best interest of your client at heart, really learning when it is appropriate to utilize a technique outside of just legal channels to further whatever it is you're trying to address. So here in Texas, we have been successful in a number of campaigns, and our campaigns, like I said, are very much focused in being informed with the workers, and staff really is there to supplement that work and to bring a certain level of expertise, but our work really is guided by the workers themselves. They are the ones that are facing these issues, and we really do see ourselves as allies supporting these efforts for change.
Great. Thank you very much, Karla. Our final presenter who's really going to drive things home for us is Lucy Stein. Lucy is the Advocacy Director with Progress Texas, based here in Austin, Texas as well. Lucy, can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you guys are doing, particularly, obviously, Texas can be a difficult climate around some of the issues that you work on, particularly reproductive justice, LGBT rights, ethics. So dealing with a difficult issue environment, what has been successful? What of the work that you have done that's really techniques that have really been able to carry the issues here in Texas?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I am the Advocacy Director for Progress Texas and our C3 counterpart, which is the Texas Research Institute. And I'll just talk a little bit about what we do more broadly, and then I can talk more about like the specific issues that I work on. So Progress Texas is focused on building and promoting progressive issue-based campaigns in Texas. Because we're not tethered to any specific party or candidate or campaign, we're able to serve as a vehicle for more permanent, long-term, and as Nick referenced, progressive infrastructure in this state that's very, very lacking. We promote issues and focus on issues that are important to the rising American electorate. So that's younger voters, under the age of 50, Texans of color, and single women. As an organization, we specialize in like traditional media outreach, online advocacy, message development. We work a large part of our work is coalition-based work, which goes to the point of infrastructure building in Texas, which is super important. We're seeing a lot more coordinated efforts going on, especially post this last election cycle. In terms of the issues that I focus on, and I'll talk more broadly about the issues that Progress focuses on, but I run our program for our reproductive health care campaign, which is focused on abortion access in Texas, not necessarily a winning issue in Texas right now. LGBT rights in Texas, so that includes marriage. Right now we're facing the RFRA amendments that we're seeing kind of pop up nationwide. We already have a RFRA on the books in Texas, so it's sort of a unique challenge here. And then we also get to work on some local non-discrimination ordinances, which we're seeing being challenged legally also throughout Texas right now. I get to work on pay equity and income inequality issues, so equal pay. Texas is one of only 8 states in the country where there's no state version of the Lilly Ledbetter Act on the books. We actually had one pass last session, but it was vetoed by our governor, Rick Perry, at the time. We work on minimum wage issues at the state legislature. We have some great bills that are being proposed right now by some awesome progressive champions in the state house, both to increase the minimum wage and to give local governments the ability to set minimum wages higher than the state minimum wage. Whether or not those bills move, they're likely not to move, but they're there. And I also work on government and accountability issues. Ethics and accountability issues, and as it relates to state government. and there's lots of those issues in Texas state government. Progress Texas, more generally, we work on voter rights issues, like voter ID law issues in Texas, Medicaid expansion, because again, Texas is not expanding Medicaid. We work on marijuana policy reform and some immigration issues. And of course, each of these issues, virtually all the issues that we work on have, intersect with social and racial justice issues, and I know that that's sort of the broad topic of today's program. So, yeah, those intersections are throughout our work, and we focus on our programs are largely digitally focused. So actually, going back to what Kirk was talking about, finding new ways to mobilize and reach people that are otherwise not engaged on these issues, but are being disproportionately impacted by a lot of these policies that we're seeing come out at the state level. So that's generally what we do at Progress.
Thank you, Lucy. So I'm going to open up the Q&A to the panelists, and I'm going to mix up the order. Even though Lucy and Karla just spoke a minute ago, I might start with them and then work back, ping pong around. So I'm going to go to Karla. Obviously, I think it's interesting the model you guys talked about in terms of creating these worker centers, and the focus is around workers' rights, and also I imagine in Texas, dealing with low-wage workers, there's a lot of issues around immigration and different status. So there's a lot of service that you're providing, and it's more of a service delivery piece. But at the same time, ultimately, you guys are a mobilization organization. Texas, as well as other states, I think we saw 2014 was pretty depressing if you care about communities of color participating in the electoral process. It was pretty bleak. There were bright spots, though, in certain cities and different communities across the country. And living here in Texas for my first electoral cycle, I know that the numbers weren't very good here. And so what are some of the tactics you've used engaging locally to really build a culture of voting among the communities that come to your worker centers?
Well, what's difficult for us to mobilize specifically on that issue is that, unfortunately, most of the workers that comprise our membership are undocumented. And so, for obvious reasons, we cannot necessarily engage in those. Yep. However, that does not mean that we have not found creative ways to mobilize that population and get them engaged on some level some level of civic engagement. And so, for example, this last election cycle, even though our membership cannot vote for the most part, what they can do and what Workers' Defense Project really strives to do is educate them on what are some of the other ways that they can be engaged in this process. So we do a lot of education around the process, the legislative process, a lot of education around specific candidates who are and are not supporting specific issues and how those will impact them at the local level. And then what we have found is that our workers then carry that messaging out in the community. We have also, this last election cycle, we engaged in a lot of, door walking and canvassing, and our workers were involved in that process with our staff in knocking on doors and educating the community about the candidates that are running for local office, especially around city council race. Here in Austin, we just had, brand new city council, and so engaging them about the issues that do impact their lives. And so, like I said, getting them out there canvassing has been one way in which we've organized and have mobilized the community. It's easy given the work that we do. A lot of our issues focus around economic issues, but of course that, given the population also, our work does intersect with immigration and with issues of racial justice. So extrapolating really those specific issues and enlightening, really providing education in terms of how these issues do affect them and that they can be involved. And even though they cannot vote, that's one way in which they can be involved. There are many other ways in which they can be involved. And so Another way that we have mobilized, for example, is we just had a huge event last week, which is called Day of the Fallen, and that is a huge day of action for workers' defense where we do some lobbying, and our worker members participate in that. And so the worker members have gone to legislators and are there to speak for themselves and talk about their own experience and why specific legislators should or should not support a certain bill because of the specific experience that they have had. So really being creative and really allowing the workers to lead our policy campaigns and really lead the work that we do, because at the end of the day, I'm not a low-wage worker in Texas. And so even though I do consider myself very much an ally, these are not, at the end of the day, these are the issues that affect them, and they are the best equipped to really tell their own stories.
Thank you, Karla. Yeah, and I've had the pleasure in the last few years to get to know some of the dreamers and some of the people doing that organizing, and it's really powerful when you hear some of these personal stories, especially these young, undocumented people in this country who you can't vote, but are so active in their community and organizing. There are people in their community who can, and you hear these stories about what they're facing and what and despite these fears that they're out there speaking up and building power for themselves and their communities. It's truly inspiring, and I think it's such important work when you're working locally in that community. So speaking local, let's stay local for a minute. Oftentimes, if you watch MSNBC or Fox News or CNN or read New York Times or Washington Post, it starts nationally, right? The conversation starts with Obama, whether it's elections or policy, then it's Congress, and then it's state governors races, and then it's the city and municipality. People often don't pay attention to municipal issues or city in both from a policy standpoint, but also a mobilization aspect. But when you're talking about influencing and making change in people's lives, that's where it really happens. And so, Lucy, you talked a little bit about that in your remarks, and I'd like you to kind of drill down a little bit more in terms of the success that you guys have seen here in Texas with some of your local ordinances, both from a policy and a change perspective, but also from a building a culture of voting and engaging people around issues.
Definitely. So yeah, I mentioned as part of our LGBT work, we've been working on these local non-discrimination ordinances that we're seeing success with. Hero made the national news. That's the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, because it came under attack from the right, and it's still being challenged in the courts by these sort of right-wing front groups presenting themselves as sort of these religious freedom, these religious liberty crusaders. But yeah, we've seen, and actually, so on the non-discrimination front, that's really the only issue that you've had the opportunity to pursue at the local level through Progress Texas. I'd love to, coming out of this legislative session, to work more on finding ways to find local solutions to some of these statewide problems and coming at them at laying the groundwork by enacting this change at the local level. So we've seen, Texas right now, there's about 7 million people right now that are covered by local non-discrimination ordinances. There's no statewide law that protects gay and transgender people from discrimination in housing, in the workplace, and in public accommodations. So that's very much a local battle right now, because at the state level we're seeing more so legislation that's intent on rolling back these wins at the local level. So we're seeing both laws that just flat out are trying to take away this local control element, trying to strip these local governments of the ability to pass these laws, and also coming at it from this religious freedom perspective, which I'm sure that you've probably heard about in our previous panel. I don't know if they touched on that because I wasn't here, but coming at it by sort of boosting the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that we already have on the books in Texas, and making an end run around these local non-discrimination ordinances by basically letting people opt out of providing any of those things that I listed before based on whatever religious whim they can come up with. But yeah, I think that in Texas, focusing on these smaller scale victories is definitely a way to push progressive issues forward. And it's definitely something that as an organization, we're going to be focusing more on coming out of this sort of all-intensive legislative session that's, you know, Texas only has, the Texas legislature only meets once every 2 years. So sort of all hands on deck right now in terms of dealing with the statewide issues. But local level initiatives will become increasingly important as we move out of this session.
Great, thank you, Lucy. And I'm sure we'll get into some more of these issues around race and around Ferguson, but I think, you know, Ferguson has been in the news, and you think about the issues in that city, it all goes down to local elections and local issues that have this tremendous impact that have created a national awakening in terms of criminalization of African-American communities. And thinking about it, it's at that local level, and that local population hadn't engaged and hadn't turned out and hadn't showed their electoral power, and it created a government and a police system that persecuted them and used them as a piggy bank to fund the government of that city. And so really thinking about these local issues and local elections, they happen mostly in odd-numbered years and in May, and that's not by accident, when people aren't paying attention, and so we need to be focusing on those issues more. So I'm going to switch over to Nick, and I'm going to probably ask a softball of softball questions. So you only had 5 minutes, so you didn't get into the details on it, but you did talk about the opportunity agenda, and I think it's important to circle back to that in terms of explaining a little bit more about what it is and why it's so important.
Yeah, and I just want to say something too on the local preemption. That is a real issue that we're seeing across the country. They have focused pretty intently in several states on these preemption bills, which don't allow localities to raise raise wages, that prevent cities from regulating things like fracking and things like that. So it is a real issue, and while it may not be the first thing you see on MSNBC, it is the first thing that they're focused on, and they have been very focused on it. And ALEC has now launched an organization called ACE, which is focused in cities, and they're working there as well. So it is a very serious thing that's been happening and that we're facing all over the country. And it's something that we have been working on and want to be and will be working on to push back. With regards to this opportunity agenda, I think I touched a little bit on it. The campaign that we're launching is called Opportunity Works for Us. And again, it is a way to nationalize all of the good work that is happening in the country and tie it to a middle class, working class agenda. And there are several components of it. So the first thing is that we want to be able to marshal resources from within the progressive infrastructure and focus it on a collective, moving collective resources towards supporting local state legislators' efforts to do things like raise the minimum wage, push back on preemption fights, that sort of thing. And so we're working with the unions, we're working with ACS, we're working with Center for American Progress, and all of these entities across the spectrum of the progressive infrastructure in a way that hasn't ever happened, to be able to focus in on the states. And we just did a great event yesterday at the White House. The White House is focused on it as well. Elizabeth Warren is another person who's helping us. So it is an unprecedented effort now to be able to focus these resources towards supporting state legislative efforts. And then the second part of it is to organize state legislators across the country to amplify a common message. So, we're providing them talking points, op-eds, ideas, things like that, so that in Illinois and in Georgia and in Texas and other parts of the country, legislators are sort of saying the same things about middle class and working class families and issues. So that's another thing that we're doing is creating this kind of communications infrastructure in the country to be able to again nationalize these issues and call out these bad bills that are coming at folks, as well as highlight the good stuff that legislators are doing. And then the third third piece of it is like I had mentioned or touched upon, we'll be launching multi-state campaigns in the coming year in partnership with groups nationally, but mostly want to focus on groups on the ground. We are right on the issues. If you take a look at what happened this past midterm election, one of the silver linings was that, in a place like Nebraska, which is my home state, they actively voted for Governor Pete Ricketts, who is crazy, but they also actively voted for a minimum wage increase, and they actively voted for the minimum wage increase in Arkansas, and they voted against a personhood amendment in South Dakota. So these things can happen in other parts of the country. It really is to focus people and speak to people where they're at. I think what happens sometimes, particularly with national organizations, there's all this focus groups, there's all these polling, there's all this, and we think that we can kind of cookie cutter language across the country. What we want to do, and we're going to be working with the Congressional Progressive Caucus and others on this, and local groups and local legislators, is going in and doing town hall meetings where we're not talking at people, we're talking with people about, what matters is that, your wages are protected, and that you have wage increases, and that your daughters get paid the same as your sons, and all of those sorts of things. And I think that's really how, that's our vision of how we're going to change things, and then amplify all of that. So that's all a part of this sort of campaign focus that we're putting together at 6.
Thanks. And let's shift back to Kirk. And one thing that I thought was interesting that you were talking about in your presentation, I'd like you to explain a little bit more, is some of the new models of organizing that are happening within the labor movement. And so if you could maybe talk about a couple of those examples and why they've been successful.
Sure. I just wanted to go to one thing that both Karla and Nick mentioned, and that is we bemoan the fact in elections that we have terrible turnout in off-year elections, but the real off-year elections, the odd years where mayors get elections, we see incredible results in terms of Boston, New York, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, where we see actually progressive mayors getting elected, and it's because they articulate a progressive agenda. And so I just feel like there's a lesson there. People will vote for minimum wage. People will vote for somebody who articulates issues that they really care about. And we just have this dearth of issues being talked about in our even years. So, the new models is really a function of obviously both opportunity and crisis for us. We had a history of organizing, like Karla, in the janitorial world, undocumented workers. It was a real challenge because we didn't quite understand. We at first couldn't figure out, how would these workers ever go on strike if they were undocumented? Why would they ever do a public demonstration if they were undocumented? But in fact, they would. They had no problem doing that. They were willing to take that risk because they saw the return on it. The same thing with home care workers who were never allowed to be considered workers, were said to have no employer, or said to not be actually workers themselves. We had to create a legal framework for them to organize, which we did. And so each of those challenges brought a new model, a model that was different than what had ever been tried before. It stretched the law, but what it really responded to is where workers were ready to move, and in each case, those workers were ready to take the risk. I think in the case of now, what we're looking at is a new group of workers, in this case primarily in the service delivery world, whether it be fast food, whether it be home care workers who work in the private sector and who work as an individual with a family or whatever, child care. All of these workers, have a sort of huge pent-up wage demand, and they're ready to step up and do whatever. In the case of fast food workers, you actually go on strike. In the case of home care workers, go out and do sit-downs, whatever. But there's a model here that we have to speak to because they are not going to get, a 35-page collective bargaining agreement from anybody. That's not where they're going to get to. What they're going to get is an organization that can get them $15 and an organization that get them $16 and $17. And that's really what we have to sort of build for them. And part of that is the law, but part of that is really, like I said, technology that allows us to basically connect these folks in a much broader, faster, cheaper way than we've ever done before. And for most of my career as an organizer, the sort of standard for an organizer on any given day was to make 10 house visits and get 4 authorization cards. If you did that, you had a job forever. That's not the matrix of, the metrics of this sort of deal here anymore. We can go to Atlanta, where we've never been before, and do a rally with home care workers, with over 200 home care workers in a space of 3 weeks, because we can go through the online system and bring those people out, bring out not only numbers, 200 or 300 people, but actually leaders who self-identify themselves. It has really changed our way to doing our business. But we have to sort of get out of our own little world of saying, oh, we need a union security clause, or we need a collective bargaining agreement. We're never going to have that. What we have to do is build an organization that people can access, get into, support, and then stay with over time. And the issues of right to work sort of go away if we start thinking that way. So for us, whether it's home care workers, no matter where they work, or joining a home care organization that's going to fight for them. Fast food workers, we're never going to get kind of union security from McDonald's, but we need to build an organization that fights for them over and over and over again. Or people in Seattle at a certain wage level get a $15 an hour, and that's a sort of a semi-political organization. So for us, it's sort of get out of our own skin, push the limits in terms of organizational structures, and then go forward from there.
So I'm gonna step kind of to a broad question for all of you, and I'm gonna use moderator privileges to answer my own question first, because I can do that. So, I want to make sure this is also applicable for you guys. I mean, I think this is a tremendous conversation. We're going to continue on these issues. But you all are law students. I understand that you guys are largely 1Ls. And so I'm sure a lot of you are thinking here about how does this apply to you and where you are in your career track. So I think it's important that maybe we have a little bit of a conversation about how the legal community, either in the actual practice of the law or in the relation to the work that you're doing, has been so vital in creating the change. I've had an interesting experience in my career with this, as kind of talked about, and as Chelsea mentioned in my bio, I ran the Election Protection Coalition at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I am not a lawyer. And then I ran the Election Administration and Voting Rights work for State Voices, and State Voices is a national network of state-based C3 civic engagement coalitions. And so I got to see that application from two ways, and I think it's important as you're thinking about that. When it comes around voting rights and election administration, voter protection, these issues at its core are rooted in the law. And so the Lawyers Committee and other legal organizations do a tremendous amount of pro bono work, working with lawyers that if you end up going down my law school bills are too high and I need to go to the corporate world, thinking about how you can still do good with your pro bono work. And the voting rights work that we did and the Lawyers Committee continues to do with our coalition partners through election protection couldn't happen without attorneys and law students donating their time pro bono. Many of the big firms pay their time to do that. But it's a way to apply your legal training to help voters to make sure that they understand the myriad of problems that impact the ability to vote. It's kind of incredible how difficult and challenging it can be for certain communities to be able to vote. The American public doesn't believe that and they reject that, so I would never use that talking point if I was talking to a broad audience, but I can talk to you about that. And so having people understand the law and how to apply it is extremely important. Something else that when I was at State Voices, a big piece of what I did was work with coalitions of grassroots organizations that were both educating voters about their rights, but also trying to make policy change around voting rights. Nick touched on Oregon's groundbreaking automatic voter registration law. Obviously, everyone knows about voter ID and voter suppression. There are other ways that we can improve the election system, particularly the broken voter registration system. It's incredible how in what should be the world's greatest democracy, a simple act of registering to vote can be such an incredible barrier, but it is. And so a number of states, there are coalitions working to change these laws, and you see a real incredible relationship between the grassroots power building organizations and the legal groups. When you're talking about the bill drafting process, what is it within state law and state constitutions that people can take advantage of in terms of how they're writing the laws? How can you be creative? Particularly in a state like Texas, you're not dropping a bill like Oregon, so what are the creative ways to drop a bill that improves the ability for people to vote? Then also, when you're fighting voter suppression and you're under attack, whether it's voter ID or eliminating early voting or eliminating same-day registration or targeting young people in terms of some policies making it harder for them to vote, you can fight as hard as you can in the legislature, but if they have the numbers, they can pass what they want. And so that immediately starts thinking about what a legal strategy is. And the most effective times when we've seen those strategies are when the legal community is working closely with the organizing community at the beginning. in terms of the bill, the lobbying campaign, and then when there's litigation, there's still a very synergistic relationship between lawyers and the lawsuit versus the organizations on the outside, through media and through mobilization, through making people understand how important these issues are, to turning the backlash against these laws into record numbers of turnout, which we saw in Florida in 2012 and other states. And so there's very much a number of ways that you guys can apply your law degrees, or you can be a lawyer and an organizer. I think we have one of those on stage with Lucy, in terms of, you might go a totally different way in your career. So you guys are very early in the process, but I do think it's important for our panelists to think about some of the ways that lawyers have been instrumental in the success that you guys have had, and things that they should be thinking about when they're going into careers. So let's go down the line. So Kirk.
Well, I think, lawyers have always been, the best lawyers have been the lawyers who tell us how to do something that we want to do, not tell us what we can't do. Some lawyers do that. They just tell you can't do that. It's really helping us figure out these new models to really actually not depend on what you've learned, but actually let your mind, frankly, not unlike what the right wing does in how they use the law. If people saw the argument that was put forward in the Supreme Court on Wednesday, that was pretty creative thinking on their part. So I just feel like we have to be equally so. We have been, I think, in the past, and primarily from lawyers like you. Lawyers not so much embedded in the past, but sort of looking forward. Lawyers who come to the table with more, I would say, community experience, organizing experience, experience in particular issues that have sort of opened them up. I think the labor movement has learned a lot by looking at what has happened in other movements, LGBT, women's, immigration. That has sort of opened us up to say it is not, don't fight this fight where they actually have the advantage, which is sort of in the sort of narrow world of labor law right now, frankly. Fight this fight in a broader context. Find the communications pattern as those movements have that resonate not just with the group of workers who you're talking about, but with the entire community, and then go at it legally, with a legal strategy, with a political strategy, with an organizing strategy that gets you there. So I think we have taken from other movements, or are trying to take from other movements who have sort of brought those, I think it was, maybe it was you, I think, putting together the legal communications and organizing together into one sort of coherent sort of frontal attack, and stay at it, resource it. That's what SEIU can do. But I think we're looking for those ideas. And as we have in the past, a young lawyer, I'll mention him, he was up for being on the board. Craig Becker was actually the lawyer who figured out how to organize 600,000 home care workers in this country. And I'll be forever grateful to him for doing that. But that system now was struck down by the Supreme Court last summer, in Harris v. Quinn. That is no longer the operative organizing model. We have to go to a new model. So.
I'm just going to echo everything that you all have said thus far, but I mean, in terms of the issues that we work on, virtually every single issue we work on right now is making its way through the courts. So there's definitely a legal aspect to working on all these issues, whether it be like abortion access, marriage, health care and federal exchanges like we have here in Texas, the voter ID law here in Texas. So yeah, I mean, just echoing what you've been talking about in terms of this coordination that happens in between communications, policy, legal. We're seeing a lot more of that happening here in Texas also. Like, we have the privilege of working with these broader coalitions of groups that while they're involved in pursuing this litigation, other partners in these coalitions can facilitate the communications aspect and the public education aspect and the mobilizing aspect of these larger campaigns. So for instance, for like a concrete example, in Texas right now, we have an ongoing challenge to the omnibus anti-abortion bill that passed in a special session in 2013. We're working as part of a coalition that one of the member partners of this coalition is one of the plaintiffs to this lawsuit, an independent abortion provider in Texas. working as part of this larger group of organizations, we're able to use this ongoing litigation as an opportunity to frame the larger debate, both in the media at large, but also among our grassroots supporters, and hopefully mobilize people to action using this sort of litigation as not as a hook, which sort of belittles it because it's doing great things right now in Texas. But there's definitely a lot of synergy right now between these policy initiatives, advocacy initiatives, and real impact litigation that's going on at the state level.
I have to say, I wish there was a panel like this when I was in law school. So it's a credit to ACS and Jake for putting something like this together, because I spent, after law school, about 5 years trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. I thought like a traditional lawyer. I went into a small law firm, then I went into a mid-sized law firm, then I went to a big law firm, and I realized I hated every second of it. And and it's nice to see that that there are other ways. It was good for me because when I was in law school, I didn't have people. There weren't people who looked like me. I didn't have most of my friends had somebody's dad who was a lawyer, or like other people that they could talk to, and I didn't know that that there were these other options out there to be a lawyer. And so I'm glad that there's sort of exposure like this to other avenues. And when I sort of in my career, when I realized you can kind of feel it. When I thought I was on the right track was when I decided to give up sort of the traditional law route and went and became a community organizer in DC, organizing immigrant communities. That felt right. Then doing like the political work that I do, that felt right to me. And so you kind of have to listen to yourselves as you're going through the law school process about really, the best thing about a law degree is it's so dynamic. You can use it. I use my law degree and my legal training every day because part of what we do is we take a look at bills, we take a look at laws, we try to think of creative ways to manipulate like the tax system to benefit people and workers. And so there are so many other ways to use your law degree, and just think about that as you're going through the process. And with an organization like ours, we want to utilize law students. As other panelists were saying, you all are not jaded or as focused as like some of the older lawyers are, or sort of dug into a way of thinking. And so we would love to think creatively about how to develop new laws and new legislation to be able to test in states. You can do that in states. You can and to use the law in those ways. And so that's one way, is that in bill drafting is a way that we want to utilize lawyers. When we run these campaigns in states, we will need kind of legal protections around, or legal support in supporting the legislators that are moving these bills. So that's another way. And so there's a number of different ways to get involved. But I think the ultimate point is just that keep an open mind as you're going through the law school process, because there are so many other ways to use your law degree than just going into a law firm and kind of going down that route.
So I want to echo pretty much everything that's been said. I also kind of bounced around a little bit after law school trying to figure out like what I wanted to do. I was always very much focused on social justice work, and all of my work has always been within the nonprofit sector, but even that to me felt very limiting. And so I wanted to be in an organization where I could utilize not only my legal training, but also my personal background in community organizing, and also my degree in policy. And so being at an organization like Workers' Defense Project, at the end of the day, it's really fun, because I kind of feel like I get to have my cake and eat it too. I am able to represent workers in court, assisting them on recovering their wages or whatever issue that they're dealing with. And then I can also be involved in the policy campaigns that we have at the organization. and also, of course, in the organizing piece of it. I don't know how many of you have actually had experience in community organizing, but it's a lot of work. Getting people to show up and support your cause and be engaged is a lot of work. And I really do commend people who are full-time organizers, because that is much more work than it is to be an attorney, to be honest with you. But it's effective, right? When you're able to get people out and mobilize people, it's effective. If you look at, for example, the wins that we had with the executive action, lawsuit aside, really that win was brought about by the Dreamers who were mobilizing and organizing and had demonstrations all of the time, and they really have an incredible way of mobilizing at the national level and really bringing those issues to light. And so getting back to you guys as future attorneys, attorneys are always going to be necessary. We have a legal system in place that is not going anywhere, and we're always going to have a need for attorneys, because people are always going to have to access a very formal legal institution, and attorneys are the pathway to doing that. And so there's always going to be a need for attorneys in any nonprofit and any in any type of social justice work, because you have to affect change at the law. Those are the laws that govern us, that protect us. And so we have to make sure that those laws are in place that serve the communities that really need them. And so then speaking directly to the work that I do, very much at a micro level relative to some of the other panelists, we have attorneys engaged in our organization at every level. We have volunteer attorneys who represent workers. We have volunteer attorneys who help us draft the bills that we work on and that we support, and that we work with legislators to make sure that they make it through. We also need attorneys for our organizing campaigns. For whenever we have a direct action, for example, we always want attorneys there in case they're needed at a direct action. And there's always going to be a need, especially for attorneys who are willing to think outside of the box and be creative, because there is a lot of creativity to be used here, and that is necessary. So a lot of the work that I do is me using my legal training to really be creative in how I can use that to best further whatever our particular agenda is on that particular issue. So I really encourage you as future attorneys to really dive in at whatever level you want, whether it's a small organization or some national agenda. Really dive in and just get some experience and keep an open mind, and understand that you are a part of a bigger piece that is moving, and that there are so many people involved and engaged, and you bring your own level of expertise to that moving part.
So we're about done with the moderator Q&A. We're going to open it up for questions with the audience. I think there's a mic there. As we get set for questions, I will say, I was hoping to get to this in the Q&A. I'm sure we'll get to it in the discussion part. I'd be remiss not to note that, this weekend is the 50th anniversary of the march across the Edmund-Pettus Bridge and Bloody Sunday. And we're sitting here in the shadows of the LBJ Library. And I think it's important to note that, in Texas and in a number of states across the South, we no longer have protection under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because of a pretty atrocious decision in Shelby County versus Holder a couple of years ago. It's something that, is tremendously impacting the ability of communities of color to vote. It's a crucial protection that doesn't exist. And a lot of the folks on this panel and other people are thinking about, creative ways to get Congress to ever act to solve that problem, which is a good challenge, but what it means, and it does mean a lot in terms of the South, where we have to now monitor discriminatory voting changes that are happening at the county level in boards of elections in different ways. Organizers are having to think about the law in different ways, and that's another avenue where we really need lawyers to work with grassroots mobilization groups to find these discriminatory changes in your communities, in these small towns. They can be very small changes as simple as moving a polling place, or annexing a district, or changing the date of elections. Things that seem innocuous on its surface, but really tremendously impact the ability of communities of color to vote. And it's another opportunity for the legal community to get involved, to identify these changes, and to make sure that that the people that can sue and litigate take action and prevent these from keeping people from voting. So I did want to make sure to say that, because I think it's an important anniversary and something to think about. So with that, I think we're going to go to Q&A. We have the first question with the lavender laptop.
Hi, my name is Tamara. I'm a 1L at University of Missouri. I want to thank you all for being here, especially you, Eric. Thank you so much for bringing up Ferguson. I think that's the first time I've heard the F word used at this convention, which is really important for me because I'm actually from Ferguson. And so I've been struggling with my first year of law school on top of the issues that happen in my very own community. And I'm glad that you brought up how the poor voter, African-American, well, you didn't specifically say African-American, but the lack of voter turnout kind of affects municipal policies and rules. And I think a lot of people don't think about that, think about national elections, but you don't really think about it at the municipal level. And Ferguson is a very good example of that. And you all have talked about organizing movement to kind of frame arguments and discussions about these progressive issues, but what are some specific strategies that I can use to take back to my community of people who think that voting doesn't change things anyway, it doesn't matter if I go out and vote, or that just don't have any faith or trust in the legal system overall?
Thank you. That's a great question. Anyone want to start? Or?
I mean, I think, the voting, the electoral system in this country is way too person-centric and not built around issues, and that's really, I think, is the critical. We have found that if you can find that issue that really galvanizes it, all the great GOTV you can do, and we do it very well in my union, it has to have the wind of issues behind its back to be successful. When we reviewed our 2010 and our 2014 work, terrible election results, actually excellent work, but there were no issues to drive voters to the polls, particularly our voters. So I just feel like, again, just a specific example, I fundamentally believe, and I've worked for the president, I've got him elected, but I just felt like the executive action on immigration, if that had happened in the summer prior to the election, I just feel, given the galvanization of what has happened in those communities, when he did it, if he had done it the summer before the election, I just feel like that would have been a game changer. There are other game changers, but I just feel like issues matter. They matter to our folks. They matter to folks whether they turn out or don't turn out, whether they think it's worth to fit voting into their very busy days. It's got to matter, and that's why, as Nick mentioned, people will vote for minimum wage. People will vote for all sorts of wage ideas in red, blue, green, or any other state. It's not incomprehensible to think that we can't put together an issue agenda, an agenda that actually links all these issues. And just one other thing, in December, in 130 cities, we had folks in fast food go out on strike. It's a predominantly African-American population, and they decided on their own that they wanted to do something about Ferguson that day, and they basically shaped those events around Ferguson. And that's another part. We just have to link these together.
Want to tackle that?
Sure. So I think with things like Ferguson, there are, particularly if you look back at like the civil rights movement, what Dr. King, what they did then was they tied the organizing to something that gave them hope. So they were looking at things like, all right, let's move towards the Voting Rights Act. Let's move towards other sort of these policy ideas to organize themselves around. So there's a moment, there's things that are happening, people are mad about that, they're fired up about that. But then how do you translate that energy into some sort of action? And I think that's what you're asking. And with Ferguson, I mean, there are particularly things you can do for police accountability. There's some bills going on, in different parts of the country where they're trying to get cameras on, police officers, not just in their not just in their vehicles. There are in Wisconsin, they have a bill for where you have the community members sort of overseeing a process if there is an officer related in a homicide that it's outside of like the prosecutorial process and holds the, so they can independently investigate what happened. So there are some things like that, but I think sometimes, particularly in black and brown organizing, black-brown communities, there needs to be some level of hope that something can actually happen. And that you need to identify and talk to the people on the ground in those communities. All right, so what is actually happening here? What do we need to do? And start locally. All right, let's see if we can turn out this amount of people. That's one win. Let's see if we can get a bill in the local, in the city council on this thing that we care about. That's a win. Let's get people turned out to testify on something. That's a win. And you start building momentum towards the ultimate goal that you want to have. And I think that's the way to do it. You have to just start very, very locally, talk about what's going on, and then build out from there. And then each one of those things is a win. Each one of those things provides hope. And then hopefully you just build this momentum towards something bigger.
Yeah, and I think, it's an important point, I think to this, like not to kind of take the example because there's something really human and really difficult and really messed up in terms of the constant persecution in that city and the stories that I haven't seen the report, but I've read the stories about it and what's come out of that report is really disgusting. But some of this is a route to how we have tactically thought about elections. There's been this, from DC and from the political class, an idea, even if you're nonpartisan, and if you're in a C3, C4, it's election comes up, we register voters, we engage them on issues, we turn them out, they vote, and then we wait for the next election and there's people lobbying. And there hasn't been enough focus, especially locally, but in terms of what happens after the elections. And that has created this sense of helplessness, right? Like, of the people that the communities have come to elect haven't done anything that they want to, or they haven't seen that tangible impact in the community. And it takes groups, it takes organizers that are out there in the community to be able to say, one, like here is the benefit of your vote and why it matters and why your voice is important, but then also there needs to be more accountability. I think that's why it's vital that we have a robust C3 infrastructure in a nonpartisan community because, I always say this, electing more Democrats isn't necessarily good for people of color, right? And so we need to hold people accountable when they get into office about what the issues they take for the communities they care about. And money in politics is a big issue in all of this. When you have corporate donors and wealth and you have a political class that might not care as much about disadvantaged populations and the bills and the policies are focused on the people that they see more, then that's when you have this skewed policy that leads to the sense of disenfranchisement, leads to the sense of disengagement. And so I think it's some of that, and it's a long-term solution. This is an issue that we're going to have to invest and focus on and have discipline about turning. But I think there's been this route in terms of how we've organized in the past that's led to this where we are. I think the good news is, and I think you've heard this in a lot of the conversations from the panelists, I think there's a realization and there's a way forward. And it's a matter of just kind of doing the work, I think, over time of getting to that point. But that's something I've been thinking about a lot, so I appreciate you raising that. I missed which the hand went first. I don't know. The microphone went around. Sure, yeah.
Thanks. I'm Dave. I'm at 2L. Eric, first of all, I think electing more Democrats is good for communities of color.
I didn't say, I said always, not always.
Fair enough. But I want to accelerate your last question. The last question you asked the panel was how can young lawyers and how can lawyers be involved in these issues? And I want to know how law students can be involved in your organizations. There's a lot of research and writing talent sitting in this room, and it seems like a waste not to get us involved right now. Our chapter's done a lot of that. We worked with DSCC, and now we're actually trying to figure out how to get involved in state legislatures with some of the work that Nick is doing. So how is it that students can get involved now so we can start building these skills now and making a difference now and not just waiting until our future legal careers?
one of the things that SIX is the there were a number of different groups that sort of folded into SIX that created this organization that we merged. One of them was a group called American Legislative Issue Campaign Exchange, or ALICE, which is a horrible name. But they did some good things. So one of the things that they did was they created this library of model bills that we now have, and they did it in partnership with ACS chapters around the country. So we had a program where we would connect to ACS chapters, and then they would help us write legislation, basically, that then we would use as a model to pass off to legislators in their states or nationally. And so we're going to kind of revitalize that program, and we want to work with Jake and others, Zanel, on sort of reinvigorating that program so that ACS chapters, student chapters can get involved in bill drafting for us and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, SEIU has a lot of lawyers. I think we do have a summer intern program, but so I'll just give you one name, judy.scott@seu.org. She's the general counsel. Go for it.
So I went to UT Law, and while I was in law school, I worked in the legislature. I interned with ACLU, and UT had a program that I think it started at Georgetown Law, but it's a clinic called the Legislative Lawyering Clinic. I participated in that. So I would just take every opportunity you can to find those. I mean, not everybody goes to school in the state capitol. I realize that, so that's sort of a unique opportunity that I had. But you can find out, the summer opportunities that you could, seek out and find. And I would use your time in law school to build those skills for sure, because that definitely has served me post law school. So.
Step in for just one quick second. I just wanted to say that Judy.Scott is actually on the ACS board. And is one of an array of fabulous board members. But I wanted to commend you, as Nick said, to speak to Jake and Zach and Zanel and the others that you work with regularly to talk about opportunities for engagement, because with organizations like SIX and a variety of others, we have been working with student and lawyer chapters to give them opportunities to organize within their communities through avenues that ACS has engaged in. And you'll see part of that this afternoon with our Voting Rights Institute, where we have been training lawyers and law students around the country in how to help deal with the aftermath of Shelby County, which is that there is no more pre-clearance regime, except for very few jurisdictions. But there is a lot to be done in voting, and there are a lot of people who are needed. So please, if any of your chapters want specific ideas, want people to connect with, want projects to engage with, want internships with public defenders' offices, we do all of that. That's really what we're here for, is to help you find those opportunities, to lift them up for you, because that's what we see as the true purpose of ACS, is to ensure that our vision of a powerful and progressive Constitution is fulfilled, and you are the ones who are going to be doing that. So thank you. Sorry for the advertisement, but I just wanted to put that out there.
So I saw a hand down here in the blue and fuchsia.
First, thank you all for coming. My name is Tiffany Curtis, and I'm a 1L at Seattle University, which goes without saying is in Seattle. That's the home of tech giants such as Amazon and Microsoft. And while Seattle is diverse enough to get something like 15 now, the minimum wage passed, a lot of the surrounding cities are actually highly saturated with these tech employees, of which the starting salary now at Microsoft for tech skills is $95,000. And so when I canvass my precinct for the Democratic Party, I find that on average about 40% actually cannot vote because they're imported for their tech skills, which is a different issue about our education system. But so my question is, in the last panel we had the question of how can we engage poor white people? So I'll do the opposite. How can we engage rich, non-voting minority groups who it seems that the state legislators actually prefer to cater to in issues that don't impact them as their immigration status is taken care of by the employer and who don't have issues economically? how can we get them involved to voice their concern about other issues?
I don't think any of our organizations are up for that population.
You know, I've been sort of thinking about that issue for a long time because my family is Indian from India, and not Native American. The funny was when I was younger, we started this organization called SALT, South Asian American Leading Together. And we spent so much time trying to figure out how to engage, we call them uncles and aunties, who are, sort of our parents' generation, in the issues that we cared about. So we were focused on organizing, South Asians who are like the taxi cab drivers, people like that, and getting those uncles and aunties who have, who had a lot of money, who were doing things like, were doctors, were engineers, engaged and attended to that. And it was very difficult. And I think where you need to start with them is to speak to them about kind of the issues that they care about. They're immigrant populations. There are ways to talk to those people about, here's what's going on with our immigration system right now, with the H-1B system, with things like that really impact you, where you're at. The other thing is, I was able to convince my parents, and I think talking not only to them directly, but talking to their kids about, and getting them to talk to their parents about getting engaged in their local politics. So those are some just like simple ways to do it, but really it's just kind of speaking to people where they're at in those communities.
I just want to piggyback off of that. So in the work that I do, it is really difficult to get people to be supportive of issues, especially economic issues as they pertain to undocumented immigrants. And so what we find is that the messaging and the framing is really important, and making it an issue that speaks to them, and framing it in such a way where they have some point of reference or some context to which they can relate to that particular issue. So for example, a lot of the work that we do, we talk about undocumented workers here in Texas being the floor for labor and employment issues. They are the floor for wages, and they actually bring down wages, because if an employer is able to pay an undocumented worker $5 an hour, which some of our workers do end up getting paid that much, and they are also the floor for safety on the job site. So when you talk to businessmen about the fact that these undocumented workers are the floor and how that affects their business, then they start listening. And so messaging and tying that issue back to a way that affects them and that they can relate to, again, getting back to being creative about the way that you're framing these issues, and again, you've got to make them care about it, and so you've got to be able to tie it back to something that affects them.
And just one other variation on that is that when you talk to anybody in this country, the number one issue is always the economy. What is holding back this economy now is that there's not enough purchasing power in this country. There's not enough people in this economy that have money to spend. Almost half the people who are working in this country are working less than $15 an hour. So when that happens, not only those folks at less than $15 an hour are impacted, but the folks above that line are impacted in terms of the economy actually booming, in terms of all the other things that, when the boats rise, they rise for everybody, but they rise best for the biggest boats. I think what we're saying to folks is, this is good for you. This is good for the economy. You're in the economy. You're a bigger player than they are in the economy, but you need to give these folks purchasing power. If they can't buy your goods, your stock portfolio is not going to rise. So it's really that fundamental thing, is that we have to build an economy where there's more purchasing power, and that means rising wages, and that means particularly at the lower level.
We have probably one more question. I see a hand in the back.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm a 3L at Georgetown. I'm kind of wondering about, I have the impression both from the previous panel and talking about kind of local non-discrimination ordinances and also state level abortion restrictions, and based upon a lot of what we've been talking about in this panel, that the battleground on a lot of these issues is not at the national level, that it's at the state level. And I think that that's frustrating for a lot of, maybe for us who, want a kind of big sweeping change immediately everywhere, as opposed to in these like smaller areas. And so I'm wondering if that is a misimpression, or if you all would agree that for a lot of the issues we've been talking about, it's going to be about the local elections and the state elections and municipal elections.
So I think maybe if you go quick down the line, answers. So,
I mean, any advancement we've made has come out of the local. I mean, really, if you look at healthcare, any civil rights, all of these things have come from local action that ultimately got to the federal action. So I think this is not unusual, but it's frustrating. But it's the reality that nothing is going to happen in Washington. So, but we can make it happen in cities and some states. We should make it happen.
I agree, and I think that we're seeing in Texas, this is sort of like the testing ground for a lot of these negative policies that roll back a lot of these rights that we're seeing. And it's definitely happening at the state level, at the local level, and that I think informs sort of what they think they can accomplish at the national level too, because we're seeing that in the reproductive justice stuff that's being proposed in Congress also. So I think the state and local informs the national, but yeah, we're seeing all of these policies play out at the state level right now here in Texas for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the same answer. I think you need to set the table, set the stage for big sweeping national change. And so you create kind of these drumbeats, this drumbeat in the states and the cities to allow for cover to be able to move big policies. Healthcare didn't happen overnight. It's been going on for generations. Same with, the Voting Rights Act. Everything that Dr. King and those folks were doing set the stage for the Voting Rights Act to be passed. And so that's why it's a dance between federal and local, but the dance starts locally.
I agree. I'm just echoing what they said. And one interesting way to see how this has played out is obviously immigration. We're not going to get comprehensive immigration reform obviously with Congress being what it is right now. And people don't want to wait for Congress to make a decision about that. So people then, get up and make that change come about on their own. And the way that happens is hear little rumblings here and there to ultimately set the stage for national. So ideally, yes, things would happen at the national level that affect all of us. But that's not the reality that we have, and we can't necessarily sit there and wait for that reality to exist in DC, and people are anxious and want that change to happen now. So that's why we have these efforts going on state by state and even county by county.
Actually, one last point. You need to have a strong federal government to protect people as well, though. So the reason Roosevelt and the progressive movement was so strong, or they focused on a strong central government, was to protect people from banks and others encroaching on the middle and lower working class. The reason JFK and Johnson believed in a strong central government is to protect civil rights and that sort of thing. And so you do need the strong federal government, but again, the local government is really where you set the stage for national sweeping change and law.
So I'll make two other points that have been made. Any federal big sweeping national change might end up in front of the Supreme Court, and that's a challenge. And then I think outside of DC, in the communities, in the cities, in the state houses is where leaders that are more connected to the communities and understand the issues that mean more to them are. And it's those legislators and those leaders that are innovating and developing policy that's going to have more of an impact. And that's where we need to focus, because I think that's where the important change happens. So I think we need to start local. It's a strategy thing, but I think it also is where the impact is happening. So with that, I do want to take 1 minute before I do some logistical things, just to give a round of applause for our wonderful panelists.